"We don't need you anymore, Dad." Mark said that in the middle of the applause, under the golden lights of the Hilton ballroom, a party thrown to celebrate my retirement. The room went silent. The wine glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor, like a life suddenly crushed to pieces. I looked at my son, the boy who used to wrap around my legs, calling me his superhero. Now he stood tall, smile cold as steel, gripping the microphone as if it were a gavel of judgment. "There's no place for old ways in this company anymore, just like in this family." Scattered applause followed. I forced a smile, but inside something tore apart. Not because of humiliation, but because I finally realized he truly didn't need me anymore. That night didn't end with a toast. It ended with silence, the kind that swallows a father's pride whole. I didn't know it then, but that moment, being pushed out of my own life, would mark the beginning of a war no one saw coming. A war between love and greed, between justice and betrayal. Stay with me. Because what happened next was far more shocking than that declaration. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, my son would have the childhood I never did. Back then, our little wooden house in suburban Portland was small, but always full of laughter. Every winter morning, I'd wake early to start the fire. The smell of burning wood mixed with Helen's coffee, my wife, whose smile could melt the frost on the porch. Mark was 6 then. He'd race around the table with a red toy car I'd bought from a thrift shop. Every evening, as soon as he heard my keys at the door, he'd jump out shouting, "Dad's home! Did you catch the electric monster?" I'd laugh, lift him up, spin him around. In his eyes, I was a real hero. The man who could fix anything, from a broken lamp to a broken dream. Dinner was simple: grilled salmon, potato soup, and stories that didn't matter, but somehow did. Helen would place her hand on my shoulder and whisper, "Don't just teach him to be strong, teach him to be kind." I'd smile. "The world doesn't spare the weak, Helen." "Maybe, but if he forgets how to love, he won't be your son anymore." Looking back, she was right. I taught him to stand tall, but never when to bow. When Mark turned 10, I was promoted to chief engineer. Helen gave me an old pocket watch engraved with 4 words: "For time and love." That night I came home late. Mark was still awake by his door, eyes heavy with sleep. "I'll make you proud, Dad." I ruffled his hair and smiled, not knowing it would be the last time I'd hear those words in that innocent voice. 3 years later, Helen died in a car accident on her way home from the market. At the funeral, Mark didn't cry. He just held my hand and whispered, "Don't go back to work. Stay with me." But I couldn't. I buried myself in my job, success as anesthesia. Every night I'd come home late, walk past his door, see the light still on. I'd hear soft sobs and tell myself he was talking in his sleep. Now I know. It was the sound of a child slowly losing his father. By 16, Mark felt like a stranger living in my house. No more running to the door, no laughter at dinner, just the clink of silverware. "How's school?" I'd ask. "Fine." One word, cold, heavy, like a wall between us. I didn't understand. I gave him everything. The best schools, his own room, a new bike, a computer. But maybe what he needed wasn't anything I could buy. Helen once said, "Mark's more like you than you think." I didn't believe her, until I saw my own cold stare reflected in my son. One night the phone rang. The police. Mark had been arrested after a fight at a party. I showed up in a wrinkled suit, ashamed and furious. "Do you realize how much you've embarrassed me?" I shouted. "You only care about your reputation," he fired back. "Everything I've done, but I did for you." "No, Dad, you did it for yourself." And then I slapped him. A stupid, desperate slap. That's when I saw it, something die in his eyes. From that night on, he never looked at me as a father again. We barely spoke after that. When he left for college, he didn't look back. I stood on the porch holding Helen's watch, listening to the sound of his car disappearing down the road. Years passed. Mark rose fast, successful, confident. I grew older, slower. We only met on holidays, always with someone else in between. Emily, his wife, polite, distant. "You should rest more, Dad. Let us handle things." I could feel myself fading, a relic in my own family. And then came that night, the retirement party. Mark holding the mic, looking straight at me. "We don't need you anymore." That's when I realized. The distance between us wasn't measured in years, but in the silence of two hearts that had stopped reaching for each other. Helen's wooden house, once filled with the smell of apple pie and laughter, had turned into a ghost of itself. After the retirement party, I decided to stay there alone, surrounded by old photographs and silence. It was the only thing left I wanted to keep. 2 weeks later, an envelope appeared under the door, stamped with the logo of a real estate firm. Notice of property evaluation, Hayes Residence. I read it twice, then again. My heart thudded, heavy and slow. The listed owner, Mark Hayes. That couldn't be right. The house had always been in my name, mine and Helen's. After she died, I never transferred it to anyone. So how? Clutching the paper, I drove straight to the agency on Main Street. A young receptionist looked up with a polite, rehearsed smile. Ah, Mr. Hayes. Yes, your son signed a co-ownership agreement last year. He's considering selling the property to a resort developer. Selling? I asked. That house is our family home. I understand, sir, but the ownership record has already been updated. Her voice faded as I just stood there, frozen. Everything around me, the hum of printers, the clack of keyboards, blurred into silence. Back home, I tore through my filing cabinet, papers flying everywhere. Buried inside my retirement folder, I found it, a power of attorney form, bearing my signature. I stared at it, hands trembling. The handwriting was mine. But the date was weeks after I was hospitalized for a mild stroke last year. I never signed anything during that time. The only person who had access to my documents back then was Mark. That evening, I called him. Mark, we need to talk. I'm busy, Dad. Can we do this later? It's about the house. Which house? The one your mother built. Silence. Then a sigh. Dad, it's just a property. You don't need to live there forever. It's not a property. It's home. Homes have value too, Dad. Something in me snapped. You're selling your mother's memory. Do you even realize that? Stop acting like you're the only one who ever loved her. Then, the click. The line went dead. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at Helen's portrait on the wall. Her smile was as gentle as ever, and for the first time, it hurt to look at her. That night, sleep never came. I sat on the porch, staring at the oak tree Helen planted the year Mark was born. The wind rustled through its leaves, each one falling like a piece of memory being stripped away. And in that quiet, I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was betrayal, the first crack in something I thought unbreakable. Emily always knew how to say exactly what people wanted to hear. I used to think she was polite, thoughtful, but later I realized every sweet word from her mouth was carefully measured, in profit. After that phone call, Mark didn't visit for 3 weeks. Then one Saturday morning I saw his car at the gate. He didn't come alone. Emily walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, smiling like someone who'd just won a quiet battle. We just wanted to check in, see how you're doing, Mark said, avoiding my eyes. How the house is doing, you mean? I replied, voice rough. Dad, the resort project's about to break ground. If we sell now, the price is great. You could move in with us. It's too cold here for you anyway. Helen used to say this house is the soul of our family, I said slowly. Not something to trade. Emily cut in, soft tone, but the knife gleamed beneath it. Sometimes the past only keeps us stuck, Dad. Mark's just trying to build a future. You understand, don't you? I met her gaze. Behind that faint pink lipstick was the cunning gleam of someone who knew exactly where the power was. What kind of future begins by burying his mother's memories? Mark squeezed her hand, forcing a smile. You're being too sensitive, Dad. No, I said quietly. I'm just not blind. The air thickened. Emily's eyes swept across the living room. The wedding photo, the old curtains, the clock Helen once polished every Sunday. She sighed with that poisonous sweetness. Such an old house. And such old people, too. I heard every word, each one cut like glass. After that day, Mark barely called. Instead, I received a letter from the bank. Request for co-owner consent to complete property sale. Everything had been arranged, too neatly. I knew then, Emily was behind it all. She had worked in real estate once. She knew exactly how to bend emotion until it snapped. I heard things, whispers, that at night she'd sit beside Mark and whisper her poison in a velvet voice. Your father doesn't trust you, Mark. He still sees you as a failure. "You don't understand," he'd mutter. "Oh, I do. You just want to be free, to prove you can stand without his shadow. But it's my mom's house. Your mother's gone, Mark. The living have to move forward. You can't live for the dead." Night after night, she fed him that sweet toxin called reason, and slowly, it worked. My son stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as an obstacle. One evening, I went to his office. I wanted to talk face to face, man to man. The secretary told me to wait. Through the cracked door, I heard Emily's voice on a speakerphone. "Yes, the property's still under joint ownership. But don't worry, I'll make him sign. The old man's soft when it comes to his son." I froze. Right then, Mark stepped out. Our eyes met. His widened in shock, then hardened into irritation. "You're spying on me now?" "No, I came to hear the truth." "The truth? That you can't let go of the past?" "No, that you're letting someone else live your life for you." I left before he could answer. Outside, rain was falling. I stood beneath the awning, watching the water carry a cigarette butt down the drain. And it hit me. The last thing I had left in this life was about to be taken, not by a stranger, but by my own son, led by the hand of someone who knew exactly how to make him forget where he came from. The day I got the notice, transaction completed, Hayes residence ownership transferred. I thought I'd misread it, my vision blurred. The signature on the contract, Mark Hayes, and under co-owner authorization, Leonard Hayes, my handwriting, my name, but not my hand. It was copied perfectly, coldly, and legally enough that even the law wouldn't question it. I called Mark, this time with no effort to stay calm. "What did you do?" "Dad, relax. It's just a transaction." "A transaction? You sold your mother's house and call it a transaction? You don't need that place anymore. I got you an apartment downtown. It's more comfortable." "I don't need comfort, Mark. I need respect." Then I heard Emily's voice in the background, calm, rehearsed. "He doesn't understand, Mark. It's done. Let's just move on." "Emily," I shouted, "stay out of this. You have no right." "I do have a right. My husband's the one paying the bills now." I froze. Her words hit like a fist, right in the gut of my pride. For 30 years, I'd carried this family on my shoulders. And now, she said it like I was some debt to be written off. Mark's voice came softer, almost apologetic. "Dad, it's already done. This deal puts me on the map. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "Pressure? You sold your mother's legacy for a title?" "Mom's been gone a long time, Dad. That house doesn't mean what it used to." I wanted to slap him, but my hand didn't move, because I knew no slap could wake him. It would only strip me of the last dignity I had left. The day they took the house, I stood on the porch as the moving trucks pulled in. Strangers walked in and out, taking down photo frames, peeling wallpaper, prying off tiles that Helen once laid herself. One of the workers paused. "Sir, anything you'd like to keep?" I pointed. "That clock and the photograph." I carried them out, one in each hand. Behind me, the house echoed with the sound of my footsteps, the hollow sound of a father's failure. But the betrayal wasn't over yet. A week later, I received a letter from the bank. "Your retirement account has been temporarily frozen due to suspected transaction discrepancies." Inside was another authorization form, with my signature again, granting Mark temporary control over my pension funds for safe investment purposes. I sat motionless, each heartbeat heavier than the last. He hadn't just sold my house, he was draining the rest of my life. That night, I went to see Grace, an old friend, now a legal advisor. She listened quietly as I told her everything, then exhaled. "Leonard, they've covered every angle. If those signatures were verified against your hospital records from the stroke, proving fraud will be nearly impossible." "You mean I was conned while I was lying in a hospital bed?" "I'm afraid so." I sat there for a long time. Outside, rain tapped against the window, soft, relentless. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly old, not because of age, but because of betrayal, because the one person I trusted most had taken that trust and crushed it, carefully, with his own hands. I collapsed right outside Grace's office, not from my heart, but from something heavier, the weight of being betrayed by my own blood. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room, white, Empty, sterile. Grace sat beside the bed, holding a folder tight. Leonard, the doctor says it was just low blood pressure, but you need to stay calm. We can fight this, if you're willing. Fight back? I laughed weakly. What's left to fight for? The truth, she said. 3 words, enough to make me meet her eyes. She was right. The truth. The only thing Mark hadn't stolen yet. When I was discharged, Grace started digging. She found the forged authorization, processed by a bank employee who just happened to be one of Emily's old colleagues. In an internal recording, Emily's voice came through, smooth and chilling. Yes, just confirm he signed during treatment. I'll take full responsibility. Grace printed the transcript, sealed it carefully in an envelope. If I'm right, she said, this qualifies as civil fraud. You're telling me to sue my own son? I'm telling you to protect what's left of Helen. I said nothing. Those words, what's left of Helen, cut deeper than any betrayal. That night I opened the small wooden box Helen had left behind. Inside were a few letters, her journal, and a photo of us, the 3 of us, when Mark was 8. I stared at that boy's eyes, so bright, so full of wonder, and I asked myself, when did that child disappear? The next day, Grace and I went to the bank. When the branch manager asked for ID, I placed my card and medical records on his desk. You're certain you didn't sign this? If I had, I said quietly, why would I be standing here now? He hesitated. Grace laid down the printed recording. The color drained from his face. We walked out into the biting winter wind. Grace's scarf fluttered as she said softly, they'll open an internal investigation, but Mark will know right away. Good, I said. I want him to know. That night, I called my son for the first time in weeks. My voice was calm, no anger, no tremor, just the exhaustion of a man who'd reached the end of his patience. Mark, I know everything. The documents, the bank. I'm not looking for a fight, but you need to explain. Dad, you're misunderstanding. No, not this time. Emily was just trying to help. I didn't mean, don't hide behind your wife. You signed those papers. Silence. Then his voice, low, hard. If you want to sue me, go ahead. I'm not afraid. The call ended with a click. Sharp, final, metallic. I stared at the black screen, strangely calm. No tears, no shaking, just one thought pulsing steady in my chest. I will take back what belongs to Helen, and teach my son what justice truly means. The next morning I met Grace again. She laid a thick folder on the table, signatures, confirmations, account statements. We have enough to file the complaint. I looked down at the papers, not just evidence but a declaration. A father's quiet vow to stand up one last time. Grace, I said softly, it's time. I'm not afraid anymore. And that was how it began. Not a war for money, but for dignity, for memory. For the woman I loved and the son who'd forgotten that once he called me his hero. That year's family gathering, as my aunt called it, was supposed to be a cozy post-holiday dinner. But I knew there was nothing cozy about it. Mark's dining room glowed under chandelier light, the table gleaming with crystal and wine. I arrived late, stepping into a room full of awkward glances. Emily greeted me with that same paper-thin smile, her lips curved just enough to hide the act she'd rehearsed to perfection. Dad, you made it. We were just discussing a new investment plan, Mark said, standing up, confidence dripping from every word. Investment? I asked, pulling out a chair. With whose money? The room froze. A few relatives traded looks, others stared down at their plates, pretending to cut their steak. Emily's smile didn't fade. Ours, of course. We're a team, aren't we, Dad? I set my glass down and looked around the table, faces from both sides of the family, once full of admiration, now silent. I drew a slow breath. If we're a team, then why am I the only one who doesn't know he's been conned? Mark stiffened. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the house your mother built, about the forged signature, about the pension funds you transferred. A spoon clattered onto a plate. Someone coughed. Emily tilted her head, trying to sound gentle. You've misunderstood, Dad. We were only trying to organize your assets. Don't call me Dad if you don't understand what that word means. My voice cracked. I stood, opened my leather briefcase, and laid a sealed envelope on the table. This is a copy of the transfer contract with the forged signature. This one is an internal recording of you, Emily, instructing a bank employee to falsify documents. And this is the official statement from the Civil Investigation Bureau. The room fell silent. Mark's face went pale. He stared at me as if I were a stranger. Dad, are you really doing this? Humiliating me in front of everyone? No, I said quietly. I'm reclaiming the truth. Emily's voice turned sharp as glass. We have nothing to hide. If you want to sue, go ahead. Oh, I will, I replied. But before the court decides, everyone here deserves to know what your perfect son has done. From the corner of the room, Grace, my old friend, stood up. She played a short audio clip from her phone. Emily's voice filled the air. Just confirm he signed during treatment. I'll take responsibility. Silence. Mark looked drained, like all the blood had left his body. Emily stepped back, words stuck in her throat. I never wanted to lose my son, I said, my voice trembling. But I won't let Helen be betrayed again. I turned to leave. Behind me came whispers, scattered and sharp. Is this real? I can't believe Mark would... That recording, was that her voice? Someone had filmed the entire scene on their phone. That night, when I got home, Grace called. Leonard, the video's online. 50,000 views in 2 hours. Everyone's talking. I looked out the window. Wind tossed dead leaves across the porch. And for the first time, I felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow, because sometimes, to save justice, you have to sacrifice your own dignity. The video spread faster than anything I'd ever imagined. By the next morning, when I stepped outside, neighbors clustered on the sidewalk in little groups. They looked at me with that strange mix of pity and curiosity. One middle-aged woman muttered, Isn't that him? Leonard Hayes? His son stole everything. Every step I took felt heavy, like walking over pieces of memory. Online, the comments were savage and sloppy, like father, like son, greedy through and through. Poor old man, shaky hands and still shouting into the void. Is this for real? Or some staged drama to hide something else? Local TV picked it up within hours. Young entrepreneur Mark Hayes implicated in alleged asset fraud against his father, the anchor said, and a graduation photo of Mark and me was sliced down the middle with the headline, Father accuses son of betrayal. Mark called me at noon. I could hear the panic in his voice and reporters in the background. Do you realize you've ruined my life? He snapped. No, you did that yourself, I said. Emily lost her deal. The project's canceled. Reporters are camped outside our house. Then maybe now you know what it feels like to have everything taken. I hung up. Hard knocks came at my front door a minute later. A young reporter held a microphone like a lance. Mr. Hayes, are you suing your son for asset fraud? Any comment? No comment, I said. Rumors say you've been hospitalized for mental issues. Is that true, sir? The question cut deep. It was the blade Emily had planted from a distance. By mid-afternoon, Grace sent me a link, an article with a headline meant to bruise. Sources say Leonard Hayes shows signs of cognitive decline, family worried about his financial decisions. Below that, a quote, the family fears his mental state is affecting economic judgment. The copy read clean, as if written to make my voice wobble. I read it a second time. It felt like hands sawed through the trust between father and son. The article reeked of Emily's strategy. Paint the old man as unreliable, and you absolve the young man's theft with concern. That evening, Mark held a press conference. He wore a black suit and kept his head bowed like a man reading from a script. My father is the man I love most, he said into the cameras. He's struggling with the pressures of retirement and his health. I only tried to help protect his assets. Behind him, Emily stood perfectly composed, eyes bright and rehearsed, clutching a printed statement. Watching them on television, I felt a hollow tighten inside me. I turned the set off, then on again. I stared at myself in the mirror. The reflection, gray hair, hollowed cheeks, but eyes that still held a steady line. If they're going to stage a lie, I told myself quietly, then it's time the old man write the last chapter himself. Grace called right after the conference. Leonard, you can't stay silent. We have to go public, legally. I'll help you compile evidence. If they use public opinion as a weapon, we'll counter with the truth. I nodded, looking out at the night, the streetlights cutting glassy lines across the window. The storm had arrived. I felt its chill down to my bones. And I understood then that the battle that mattered most wasn't just for property. It was for my wife's memory, for my name, and for the last piece of my son that might still remember what it meant to call me father. 3 days after Mark's press conference, a major TV network invited him onto a primetime talk show, The Real Line. The topic, family, honor, and trust. I knew Emily had arranged it. They wanted to turn me into the confused old man, to bury the story once and for all. Grace looked at me, worry and determination mixed in her eyes. If you don't speak today, Leonard, they'll bury the truth forever. I'm not afraid of humiliation, I said quietly. I'm afraid people will believe Helen raised a traitor. So I agreed, but didn't tell anyone. The recording took place downtown. Mark sat at the center of the stage, calm and polished, a glass of water in hand. Emily sat beside him, makeup flawless, smile rehearsed. The host began softly, with that tone TV anchors use when pretending to care. Mark, the video of your family has shocked a lot of people. Can you tell us what really happened between you and your father? Mark sighed, voice low and tender, perfectly measured. My father's a wonderful man, but old age can make people confused. I've only tried to protect his assets from risk. The audience murmured with sympathy. The perfect script. Emily took his hand, lowered her head, dabbed a tear that wasn't there, and then the host's voice cut through the air. We've just received word that Mr. Leonard Hayes is here with us tonight. The crowd gasped. Mark froze, spinning around. I stepped out from the audience, slow, steady, in my worn gray suit, a sealed envelope in my hand. Cameras whirred to life, flashes popping like gunfire. Dad, Mark stammered. What are you doing here? I'm here to tell the part of the story you forgot to mention. I laid the envelope on the glass table. Yeah, this is the original authorization form, with my real signature. And this, I said, pulling out another file, is a recording of Emily telling the bank clerk, Go ahead and confirm. I'll take responsibility. The studio lights seemed to flare brighter. The host gave a subtle nod to the technician. The recording played, Emily's voice echoing across the set. There was no denying it. Gasps rippled through the audience. Emily shot up from her chair, face drained of color. Mark dropped his gaze, his lips trembling, trapped in silence. Mark, I said, my voice breaking but clear, I don't want your money. I don't need my name cleared. I just want you to look at yourself before you lose everything. No one spoke. Only the quiet hum of cameras capturing every second, the slow collapse of a sun exposed before the world. That night, the broadcast became the top headline everywhere. Public opinion flipped overnight. News tickers blared. Father proves truth. Young entrepreneur Mark Hayes and wife accused of financial fraud. But there was no joy in it, no satisfaction. As I walked out of the studio, Grace asked gently, How do you feel? I looked toward the horizon, where the sunset spilled gold across the city glass. Lighter, I said softly. But emptier too, because sometimes, to find justice, you have to lose the person you love most. The morning after the talk show, I sat in Grace's office, a small room full of folders and the smell of strong coffee. Outside, the sky was the color of old steel. Grace put a thick file on the desk. On the cover, in bold type, Civil Complaint, Leonard Hayes versus Mark Hayes, Emily Cross. If you sign, Grace said slowly, we step into a legal battle. There's no backing out. I've already lost the house, the money, and my son, I replied. What else is left to lose? The pen hit the paper, ink bled into the fibers. I signed. No trembling. No hesitation. That same day, Grace filed the complaint in Oregon State Court and moved for a temporary restraining order to prevent Mark from dissipating assets. In less than 24 hours, Mark's personal and corporate accounts were frozen. The headlines spread like fire. By afternoon, my phone rang with the same frantic voice I'd heard at the dinner table. You've ruined everything, Mark shouted. No, you did when you chose betrayal, I answered. You think you've won. I'll hire the best lawyers. I will. Use whatever cash the court hasn't frozen yet, Mark, I said, and hung up. There was a hollow in my chest, but inside that hollow a strange calm settled, the quiet of a man who, after years of being wronged, finally stands on the side of what's right. When the first summons arrived, the media swarmed again. New headlines read, From talk show to courtroom, father sues son in high-stakes financial dispute. I looked at the paper and let out a soft, humorless laugh. My son had once boasted about landing on Forbes' cover. Now he dominated the front page's legal white-collar crime section. Grace slid me a list of suspicious transactions, $47,000, withdrawn over 10 days after my hospital stay. 2 phantom investment contracts signed with my name. An off-books account titled Hayes Holdings 2, signed by Mark, with Emily listed as co-signatory. They'll argue you consented, or that you weren't lucid, Grace warned. Well then, I said, we'll show them what lucid looks like. I began keeping a daily log. Every call, every visit, every instance Mark had come to the hospital. I wrote down the morning he brought a laptop and asked me to sign what he called insurance forms. I remembered how weak I was then, how I'd glanced at the paper and signed, trusting the child I had raised. Looking back, I knew that was when he'd traced my handwriting to forge it later. Grace, I said one afternoon, staring out at a city washed in late light. They took more than money. They stole a father's name. Then we'll take both back, she replied. We prepared evidence, subpoenas, account ledgers. We built a simple, terrible story from paper and ink, how a son used access, proximity, and opportunity to hollow out the life of an old man who'd believed his family meant more than profit. Filing the complaint felt like dropping a stone into a pond. The rings spread outward, slow and relentless. Friends called with cautious encouragement. Strangers sent messages of support. Some relatives predictably took sides. People asked if I wasn't making things worse, turning private grief into public spectacle. I understood the question, but the thought of silence frightened me more. If I stayed quiet, they would reframe the story. An old man's confusion, a son's benevolence, a helpful daughter-in-law steering the ship. The truth would be buried in polite conjecture. So I signed, I filed, I waited. And in that waiting, a clarity returned. Not the foolish certainty of youth, but the clear-sightedness of a man who'd been stripped down to the essentials: memory, proof, and a stubborn refusal to let a grave injustice pass unchallenged. That night, alone with a cup of bitter coffee, I opened Helen's little wooden box again. I touched the photograph of Mark at 8, a child with eyes full of trust, and promised myself that whatever the cost, I would fight not only to reclaim money and house, but to salvage the last pieces of dignity that remained in our name. The morning of the hearing, Multnomah County Court was packed. Media lenses pointed at the courthouse doors like vultures waiting for the main event. I walked in slow but steady, wearing my old gray suit. Grace was at my side, her arms full of files that felt as heavy as the day itself. Across the room, Mark entered with a team of lawyers 3 times larger than ours. He wore a black suit and a red tie, face composed, eyes avoiding mine. Emily followed, sunglasses on, expression waxen and cold. The judge struck his gavel. This is the matter of Leonard Hayes Ver, Mark Hayes, and Emily Cross, alleging forgery and unlawful appropriation of assets. We will proceed. Mark's lead counsel rose first, a mid-aged man with graying hair and a slick, practiced voice. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Mark Hayes, only acted to protect an elderly father who shows signs of cognitive decline. The signatures and transfers were voluntary and within the scope of his authority. Mr. Hayes has been confused. Murmurs moved through the gallery. Grace squeezed my hand, a quiet reminder to stay steady. Then it was our turn. Grace stood and spoke, each word clean and hard as steel. Your Honor, we have concrete evidence that Mr. Hayes was lucid at the time of these transactions, and that the signatures were forged, as confirmed by an independent handwriting analysis. She opened her briefcase and produced 2 documents, both authorizations side by side. The courtroom screen magnified them. Every loop, every straight stroke. The examiner read aloud. Conclusion: the second document's signature was digitally replicated from Mr. Leonard Hayes' sample. It is not a genuine, handwritten signature. Emily's head dipped. Mark's jaw tightened. The air in the room changed. Who submitted these documents? The judge asked. A bank employee acting under the instruction of Ms. Emily Cross, Grace replied, and she cued the audio. Emily's voice echoed through the courtroom. Confirm it. I'll take responsibility. Silence fell like a lid. Mark's attorneys scrambled, asking for a brief recess to challenge the admissibility of the evidence. But for those minutes, all I could do was sit and watch my son, the boy who used to run to meet me at the door, appear before me like someone else entirely. The hearing ran more than 4 hours. Witnesses were sworn, ledgers were inspected, digital footprints unearthed. When the judge finally ruled to grant a temporary freeze on all assets related to the dispute pending final judgment, Mark's shoulders slumped. Grace leaned in and whispered, "A first win, Leonard, but this won't be the end. They'll retaliate." "I know," I said, "but this time I won't step back." Exiting the courthouse, reporters surged. A microphone was thrust under my face. "Mr. Hayes, do you regret bringing your son to court?" one reporter asked. I stopped, looked straight into the camera, and answered without flinch, "No." If I stayed silent, I would have killed the last piece of him that remembers what it means to be a son. The line ran across headlines the next day, stark, blunt, impossible to ignore. People argued about morality and motives. Some called me vindictive, others courageous. But inside, the echo of the judge's gavel stayed with me, a sound that meant the fight had turned from private sorrow into public reckoning. And as we walked away from the courthouse, the first legal boundary had been drawn. The case was no longer just about money, it was about truth, and whether a man's life could be reduced to paperwork and profit. They didn't wait for the court to decide. Mark and Emily attacked where I couldn't fight back, in money and narrative. The night after the hearing, an online headline cut across my name, "Old Man Duped." Or staging a publicity stunt? Attached was a grainy scan of a medical note claiming Leonard showed mild cognitive impairment during hospitalization, just enough to seed doubt. Emily hired a PR firm with deep reach. They framed the story: an emotional, vulnerable father, overwhelmed by retirement, a devoted son doing the right thing. Social feeds filled with snide comments. Modern men use lawsuits for cash. Who knows if the old man is lucid? The press panic rattled Mark's backers. A previously sure contract went on hold. Some relatives turned away, worried about collateral damage. Emily posed at charity events, camera-ready smile. Photos promptly slipped to the press. A portrait of the perfect family they wanted the world to believe in. Grace worked through nights, gathering every stray pebble of rumor like wounds to stitch back together. She said flatly, "They think silence buries truth. We'll answer with process, with evidence, and by forcing them into the light." Her first move was to hit the source. She subpoenaed my full hospital records for the period I was admitted. She ordered a second independent handwriting analysis. And most importantly, she filed criminal complaints against the bank clerk and any accomplices for document forgery. That complaint forced an expedited criminal probe, something PR couldn't spin away. Then Grace used what she called a light strategy. Instead of rebutting the PR claims on the surface, she demanded production of emails, transaction logs, and internal call records between Emily and the bank. Once the documents were summoned, the PR scaffolding started to wobble. An email showed signs of tampering, timestamps didn't match server logs, and an allegedly independent memo had been backdated. A freelance investigative reporter who'd once been courted by Emily's firm suddenly changed course after comparing server logs. His new piece ran with a brutal headline: "Medical records altered, cracks in the Hayes defense." Counterpunches began to land. A partner bank opened an internal audit. A sponsor publicly withdrew to avoid association with impropriety. Mark felt real financial pressure for the first time, not just a rumor mill. Emily lost advisory contracts. Once friendly partners started keeping their distance. At the next hearing, Grace didn't just submit the handwriting report. She put the bank employee on the stand. Under mounting evidence, the witness confessed he had acted on Emily's instructions and received an undisclosed payment. The testimony hit the PR narrative like a hammer through glass. Cameras whirred, microphones picked up every syllable, and public opinion tilted. I stood there and listened to it all. No triumph, just a slow easing of a weight I'd carried for months. I thought of Helen. I thought of the boy in the photograph who used to run to me with scraped knees. I thought of the long nights with Grace, drafting subpoenas and following paper trails, of the small relentless work that makes truth visible. Grace squeezed my hand and said quietly, "We've pulled the curtain back. Now we wait for justice to do the rest." The media storm cooled. Sympathy began to trickle back. But Grace reminded me that the legal road was long, and that Mark, though broken, was still my son. I watched him in court that day, hollowed, no swagger left. My feelings were messy. pain braided with pity. In that battered clarity, I found a final truth. To protect Helen's memory and to teach Mark a lesson about conscience, I had to see this through, not out of spite, but out of obligation. Grace had put the pieces together. Now the law had to finish the work. Early one March morning, as I was pouring coffee, the phone rang non-stop. Grace's voice on the line trembled with disbelief and adrenaline. "Leonard, it's everywhere. The Portland Daily Herald just broke it. Father defrauded by own son. Lawsuit shakes Oregon." I opened my laptop. There it was, my tired old face on the front page, standing on the courthouse steps. Next to me, a photo of Mark, head bowed, jaw clenched. The subheadline cut deep. Father's forged signature places son and daughter-in-law at center of investigation. By noon, the whole city was talking. Local stations replayed the footage. Social media erupted. On Facebook, the comments stacked like wildfire. "Can't believe a son could do that." I worked with Emily once. She's no saint. Hope the court gets it right. Betrayal like that can't go unpunished. Every hour the story doubled in reach. Clips from the old talk show resurfaced. Me, quiet under the stage lights, beside Emily's polished, artificial smile. Internet sleuths dug up her old social media posts, luxury parties, champagne toasts, deals that suddenly looked suspiciously fake. A post from 2019 resurfaced. "I don't believe in luck, only in knowing who to use." The image showed a diamond ring and a half-finished glass of wine. That line poured gasoline on the fire. Within 48 hours, Emily was fired from her firm, Cross Financial, once proud to call her its golden face. A prim anchor on live TV read the statement flatly. "Cross Financial has terminated Emily Cross for serious ethical violations." Mark stayed silent. No interviews, no statements. But in the world of social media, silence is confession. Hundreds of strangers messaged me, some with support, some with apologies for ever doubting the old man. I answered none of them. I just stared at my cooling coffee, feeling both lighter and sadder. Grace said quietly, "The tide's with you now, Leonard. But be careful. The crowd that cheers today can turn faster than the wind." I nodded. I understood. I'd once believed my son was on my side too, until he wasn't. That night, rain beat against the porch. The lamplight fell across the photo of Helen and little Mark. I touched the wooden frame and whispered, "Helen, they finally see. I kept my promise. No one will stain the house you built." But I didn't yet know. While the storm raged outside, a quieter wave was forming inside Mark's mind. A tide of guilt and collapse that would soon sweep him further than any court ever could. 3 days after the news explosion, Mark's world crumbled faster than anyone imagined. Hayes Capital, where he served as CFO, issued a terse statement. "Mr. Mark Hayes has been placed on temporary suspension pending an internal investigation related to allegations of financial misconduct." Cold words, sharp as glass. The company's stock dropped 11% in a day. Partners who'd once shaken his hand at conferences quietly deleted photos, canceled meetings, erased every trace. At the office, whispers followed him down the hall. "Morning, Mark." "Yeah," he muttered, slamming the door behind him. On his desk, warning letters, canceled contracts, anonymous hate messages. A gossip site ran the headline, "From Prodigy to Pariah, the Betrayal of Mark Hayes." A photo of him and Emily at a company gala was edited with the caption, "The unfaithful heir and the deceptive wife." Mark smashed his phone against the wall. "They don't know anything. None of them understand why I did it." But the truth was, neither did he anymore. Emily understood timing better than loyalty. That night, when he returned to their apartment, her suitcase was already by the door. "Where are you going?" he rasped. "I need space. The press won't stop. I can't be dragged down too." "And me?" "You'll figure it out, Mark. You always do." He reached for her hand. "Emily, we did this together. You signed, you knew. They only see you. I'm just the wife. And I plan to stay that way." The elevator doors closed on her face. Calm, perfect, untouchable. Mark sank to the hallway floor, clutching the chain she'd left behind. That night he sat in the dark, watching his own downfall on TV. The reporter read slowly. Sources confirm that Mark Hayes withdrew over $47,000 from his father's account while Mr. Leonard Hayes was hospitalized. The numbers hit like verdicts. Online, creators stitched montages titled From Success to Shame, The Rise and Fall of Mark Hayes. 2 million views in 48 hours. He turned off the TV. Outside, Portland still glittered. Inside, the room suffocated in silence. For the first time in years, he remembered the night his mother died. The night he held my hand and whispered, "I'll make you proud, Dad." Now the memory echoed like a bell tolling for the dead. The phone buzzed again, a reporter's voice flat and merciless. "Mr. Hayes, rumors say your wife has left Oregon." Any comment? Mark didn't answer. He hurled the phone, then folded in on himself, sobbing, not out of fear or anger, but the raw recognition of what he'd become, the architect of his own ruin. Mark vanished for 2 weeks. No press, no updates, until a gas station attendant outside the city recognized him sleeping in his car. Unshaven, hollow-eyed, shirt wrinkled, he looked like a man who'd misplaced his soul. When police asked questions, he said only, "I didn't commit a crime. I just have nowhere left to go." The photo hit the morning papers. Mark slumped over a table, a cold cup of coffee before him. But this time, no outrage followed. Only silence. Comments shifted. "Poor guy. He's paid enough. Maybe he finally understands." Grace brought the paper to my kitchen. "What will you do, Leonard? The world's on your side now." I sat for a moment, then said, "It's not about winning anymore. I don't want to see another person destroyed." That afternoon I wrote a letter, by hand, and sent it to the Herald, the first paper that had covered our case. They published it under the headline, "A Father's Letter to His Son, and to Anyone Lost to Greed." I once wanted my son to suffer for what he'd done, but justice isn't about destruction, it's about recognition. I forgive Mark, not because he deserves it, but because I need peace. Any of us can lose our way when love gives way to fear and ambition. If a father cannot reach out, then what's left of this world but hatred? The letter spread like wildfire. Over 1 million shares. Hundreds of thousands of comments. People called it the letter of compassion. Headlines changed tone. From betrayal to redemption. A father's forgiveness inspires Oregon. Mark read it in a rented apartment. When he reached the last line, "I'm still here if you want to come home," he broke down. It wasn't anger anymore, nor shame, just the collapse of a son who finally understood that what he'd betrayed wasn't money, but unconditional love. 3 days later, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Mark stood there, thinner, red-eyed, silent. He didn't speak. He simply knelt. I froze, then placed my hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Get up, son. No apologies. Just live right. That's enough." Behind us, Grace quietly wiped her eyes. Outside, the first snow of the season drifted down. That morning, Portland felt still, cleansed, as if the city itself had exhaled. The story once called Father Betrayed by Son no longer stood for scandal. It became a lesson about forgiveness, about grace, and about how justice, in its truest form, is sometimes written not in courtrooms, but in the human heart. On a morning when Portland lay under a sheet of snow, I walked back into court. Unlike before, I carried no bitterness, no rage, only the calm of a father who had reached the end of a painful road and still kept his humanity. The gallery was packed. Reporters crowded the hallway. On the defense bench, Mark sat quietly. No sharp black suit, no swagger. Just a thinner man, hands knotted together, eyes sunken but clear. Emily wasn't there. She'd left the state 3 weeks earlier, sending only her lawyer and a 12-page statement denying everything. It didn't matter. The evidence was complete, and Grace, a silent field commander, knew exactly where the final pieces belonged. The judge was Martha Klein, known for being strict and fair. When the gavel came down, the room fell into absolute silence. Grace opened. "Your Honor, we are not here for vengeance. My client, Mr. Leonard Hayes, is here to prove that trust cannot be bought and that justice still has a voice." She placed a thick file on the table. "These are the records of every forged transaction, alongside an independent signature analysis verifying the authentic hand. And this," she lifted a small USB, "is the final recovered audio between Ms. Emily Cross and the bank clerk, restored from the original server, clearly stating, 'Do it. Mark has agreed.'" The judge signaled to play the clip. Emily's voice filled the room, followed by Mark's. "Do it. My father will never know." The sound rang cold as steel. Mark lowered his head. His hands trembled. I stayed still, not looking at him, not angry, just gripping the chair's edge. The defense tried to argue that Mark had been coerced, but Grace produced the bank transfer slip, signed by Mark himself. Judge Klein nodded. "The court recognizes sufficient evidence of forgery and unlawful appropriation." Mark lifted his face, lips unsteady. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak." Everything paused. Grace tipped her head, her eyes softer now. Mark stepped to the stand, drew a breath. His voice was hoarse, shaking, but honest. "I can't justify what I did. I was greedy. I was afraid. I was weak. I wanted to prove I could succeed without my father. The harder I tried, the more I lost, including myself. I plead guilty." A long exhale moved through the gallery. Judge Martha studied him, then said, "Your plea is noted, but justice is not only punishment, it's a reminder to those who've forgotten the roots of trust." Tears blurred my vision. I didn't see a betrayer anymore. I saw that little boy in the rain, squeezing my hand, saying, "I'll make you proud." Just as Mark bowed his head, and it seemed everything was over, Grace asked permission to submit one final document. She approached the bench with a worn brown envelope sealed with red wax. "Your Honor," she said, "this was found in the safe of Mrs. Helen Hayes, the late wife of the plaintiff. She founded the Portland Youth Foundation and owned the home at the center of this dispute. I believe this may change how we see today's case." The judge nodded. Grace broke the seal carefully. Inside lay a handwritten letter, paper yellowed with time, Helen's gentle script. She read slowly, voice catching. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Leonard, you're steadfast, sometimes too cold with your feelings. But I know your love runs deeper than your words. If our son ever loses his way, don't correct him with anger. Use mercy. Only love can make a person see who they've become." The room went still. Grace looked at me. "There's a second part," she said softly. "From Helen to Mark." The judge motioned for her to continue. "Mark, my son, I don't know the man you'll be, but I believe there's goodness in you. If you ever hurt your father, remember, you don't need to defeat him. You need to understand how much he loves you." Her final words hung in the air. No one moved. Mark dropped his head. Tears struck the polished wood. I stood. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to speak." Permission granted, I turned to my son. "Helen always believed you were good. I forgot that. I let pride block the light in you. I don't want you in prison. I want you to understand. Money buys anything but trust. When you lose trust, you rebuild it with the rest of your life." The courtroom held its breath. Grace's hand rested lightly on my shoulder. Judge Martha studied us both. "Mr. Hayes, do you know your words just saved the soul of this case?" I managed a tired smile. "I only did what my wife asked of me." In a rare moment, the judge allowed a brief recess for father and son to speak alone. Mark stepped toward me. No titles, no plaintiff or defendant, only a son's broken voice. "I'm sorry, Dad." "I know," I said, "and so does Helen." I held him, our first embrace in 10 years. No more shattering, only warmth, as if Helen were still here. When court reconvened, Judge Klein ruled. "The court finds that forgery occurred. Considering the guilty plea, the cooperation with investigators, and the plaintiff's request for leniency, the court sentences Mark Hayes to 3 years of community service, orders forfeiture of all illicit assets, and restores ownership of the house to Mr. Leonard Hayes." The gavel struck, final and clear. But there was no victory in me, only a quiet peace, because in the end, justice hadn't arrived by verdict alone, but by mercy. 3 months later, spring finally reached Portland after a heavy winter. The story of a father who sued his son and then begged leniency for the betrayer ran everywhere. No one called me a victim anymore. They called me the old man who turned justice into mercy. Mark began his community sentence at the Haven Workshop, a volunteer center Grace and I launched last year. Built on the ground where Helen's old house once stood, it had become a small shop where the unemployed, the formerly incarcerated, and young people starting over learned skills and earned dignity. On his first day, Mark quietly swept the yard. People recognized him, the man from the headlines, but no one jeered. Grace simply said, Everyone here has a past. What matters is what you choose now. Mornings, Mark taught basic computing to a group of orphans. Afternoons, he worked the lumber room. At night, he stayed late, repairing beat-up tables and chairs, fitting wood to wood like a man stitching together the broken pieces of himself. I stopped by most evenings, no longer the father demanding justice, just an old man with a cup of tea, watching his son work in silence. When our eyes met, he'd nod. I answered with a small smile. Enough. No more words needed. In June, Grace hosted a small gathering with local nonprofits. She stood on stage beside us and said, "Some cases end with a sentence, others end with awakening. Justice isn't only to punish, it's to teach people how to begin again." Applause rose. Light fell across the banner behind us. The Haven Workshop, where mistakes are remade into second chances. Articles followed. A major paper wrote, "From betrayal to redemption, the Hayes family turns a lawsuit into a path to healing." A television special aired, "Justice Washed Clean by Mercy." Its final shot, Mark and me planting a young oak in front of the workshop. At the base, a small plaque with Helen's words, "Forgiveness is the highest form of justice." One late summer afternoon, Grace and I sat on the porch. She asked, "Leonard, do you ever regret forgiving?" I watched the light sift through the leaves. No. If I hadn't forgiven, the heaviest sentence wouldn't be on Mark. It would be on me. She nodded. "Helen would be proud of you." "No," I said gently. She'd be proud that her son found his way back to the light. Across the yard, Mark helped some kids repaint the signboard. Their laughter rose with the wind. In that moment, I knew Helen was still here. In each breath, each small kindness, each person learning how to start again. At sunset, I stood and looked at the young oak by the door. A breeze moved through the leaves, a soft wave like a greeting. I spoke, low and steady. Justice isn't in the verdict. It's in how we choose to live after we walk out of court. Grace smiled. Mark turned toward me. For the first time in years, he said, "Dad, I'm still trying to make you proud." I didn't answer. I opened my arms and pulled him in. A long embrace, enough to erase the years of hurt, enough to close a journey where, at last, justice was made clean by mercy. After the verdict, the name Emily Cross disappeared from every major outlet. No more gowns on red carpets. No more profiles of Portland's power woman. In a matter of weeks, she was erased from the glittering world she'd built for herself. Partners severed ties in sequence. A financial firm posted the reason plainly. Miss Emily Cross engaged in fraud and intentionally interfered with bank records. Our organization does not tolerate ethical violations. It was a second sentence, one dealt by reputation, crueler than the courts. Emily fled Oregon on a rainy March night. A black Lexus cut through the fog, carrying clothes, a few forged papers, and a panic without exits. She crossed into Seattle and rented a small apartment on the edge of town where no one recognized the woman once listed in a business magazine's 30 under 30. But you can't outrun memory. Every morning she faced the mirror, gaunt face, fine lines spreading at the eyes, and heard the echo of days burned bright and gone to smoke. "You're brilliant, Emily. Someone like you will go far." Mark had said it once, at a party she no longer remembered clearly. She had believed she controlled everything, men, money, the narrative. Now no one listened, no one feared her, no one needed her. Her former real estate firm filed a civil claim for damages. The bank demanded the return of facilitation fees she'd slipped under the table. Within 6 months, she'd lost everything, from high-rise apartment to damp, stale room for rent. She lived on dwindling savings and a handful of pawned jewelry. At night, Emily dreamed of court. The judge's voice tolled like a bell. The sin is not only the signature, but the greed beneath it. She woke with her heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat. But the worst nightmare wasn't the judge's face. It was Mark's, the man she'd puppeteered. She remembered their last moment, his eyes clouded with fear and weakness as he begged, "Don't leave me." She turned away, certain he'd never stand on his own. Now he had. And she had fallen. A battered TV and a greasy spoon, where she sometimes ate, ran a segment. The Haven Workshop, where mistakes are reborn. Footage of Leonard holding Mark, a young oak tilting in the sun. The reporter said, Leonard Hayes and his son have become a human symbol for Oregon. Their story is inspiring thousands. Emily went still. On the screen, Mark looked thinner, calm-eyed, hands rough but warm. She realized she didn't hate him. She envied him. She envied that he'd been forgiven, and no one loved her enough to try. She stepped back into the rain. Neon bled across the pavement, and her shadow stretched behind her, shivering, like a smear of the past. For the first time in her life, Emily felt afraid. Not of getting caught, of having to keep living. Seattle isn't kind to former comets, people who burned bright, had everything, and then fell like a rotten leaf. Emily rented a third-floor walk-up with peeling paint and a window that faced a parking lot. Morning was a soundtrack of horns and rain on tin, an anthem for a life dimmed out. She took a temporary job at a tiny cafe near the university. The owner, an older Mexican man, quiet and spare, paid $10 an hour, enough to eat, barely. On her first day, a young server eyed her and whispered, "You used to be Emily Cross, right? The woman from the Hayes case?" Emily froze, then gave a thin smile. "No, you're mistaken." "I'm not. I've seen you on TV," the girl said, smirking before walking off. From then on, people watched her with mingled curiosity and disdain. She worked silently. Her hands trembled over the espresso wand, the same hands that once signed million-dollar contracts. At night, she sat in the dark room, eating instant noodles, listening to rain. Her ancient phone buzzed with anonymous messages. "Serves you right. People like you belong in jail. You wrecked a family and now you want pity?" She shut it off and tossed it in a corner, but sleep still wouldn't come. Faces from the past lined up in her mind, partners shaking hands, reporters singing praises, and finally, Mark reading his mother's letter in court. She'd felt nothing that day. But now tears came, salty, hot, falling onto the cold table. In the third month, the cafe let her go. The owner said simply, "Customers don't like you here." No one argued, no one said thanks. She wandered along the river. On a bridge, a group of teens pointed, "Hey, that's the woman who betrayed her father-in-law. She looks homeless now." Their laughter stung worse than rain. She ran until the downpour hid her tears. She collapsed under a roadside oak, the kind that reminded her of Leonard. The old man she'd dismissed as rigid and obsolete was now the city's emblem of grace. And she, just a stain washed away, a memory no one wanted. That night, Emily bought a cheap notebook at a thrift store and started writing. Not apologies sent to anyone, just a private ledger of guilt. On the first page, Day 1. I thought I was clever. Turns out I'm a coward. I traded everything for ambition and got this emptiness in return, a place where no one says my name. Day 2. She wrote the tricks, the parties where she faked a laugh with Mark, the lies she told the bank. Day 3. She wrote about Helen, a woman she'd never met but resented, because Helen embodied what Emily lacked: mercy. If you were alive, you would despise me. Still, I wish I could meet you once just to say, I'm sorry. She wrote every night until her hand calloused and the ink smeared. The journal became the only place she told the truth. No more roles, no more voice she didn't believe. In the 4th month, a storm pounded Seattle. Wind shrieked against the windows. By candlelight, she wrote the last line of her first notebook. I've lost everything, but maybe for the first time in my life, I'm not lying. She closed the cover. A tear dropped and bled into the final stroke. Thunder rolled outside. In that narrow room, Emily Cross, who once imagined she held the power of life and death, was just a shadow rewriting the final sentence of her own case. Winter came early. Seattle sank into gray fog and a cold that bit through skin. Emily coughed for weeks. No money for a doctor, just a cheap bottle of syrup from a corner pharmacy. She grew thinner, paler. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold a pen. Still, she wrote, final journal pages in smeared ink, her handwriting listing to one side like a failing breath. One afternoon, sorting old clippings, she found the photo from the Haven workshop story, Leonard and Mark standing together, smiling in front of the plaque. Forgiveness is the highest form of justice. She stared for a long time, then gave a rasping, broken laugh. Justice, she whispered. And me. There's no one left to forgive me. That night she opened the notebook and added, "If I could go back, I would choose honesty. Not because I fear prison, because lying made me alone." 2 days later, she collapsed at the table. The landlord found her and called an ambulance. Diagnosis: severe pneumonia, systemic weakness, no visitors, no family, no friends, no news. She watched the blank hospital ceiling and listened to the monitor tick, steady like a clock counting down. A young nurse asked softly, "Anyone we can call?" She shook her head. After a moment, she whispered, "I have a letter. For 2 people. They probably don't want it." "Write it," the nurse said. "Whether they read it or not, that's theirs to decide." That night, Emily asked for paper. Her hands trembled. The script was crooked, but each line was truer than anything she'd said in years. To Mr. Leonard and Mark, "I don't ask for forgiveness. I only want to tell you a dream I had. I saw your old house, warm light in the window, the smell of apple pie, and Helen laughing. She looked at me, not angry, and said, 'You know you were wrong. That's enough.' Maybe she never said that in life, but in the dream it was real enough to believe. I thought power and money would keep me alive. They only helped me die slower. I used the man I loved as a tool. I hurt a father who only wanted to keep his wife's memory. I have nothing now. But at least I've learned fear. Fear of what I did. Fear of who I am. If this reaches you, I hope it won't stain the peace you found. Mark, you were forgiven. Don't repeat what I taught you. Don't turn fear into ambition." Leonard, thank you for not seeking revenge. If there is another life, I want to be the stranger outside your home just to hear your family's laughter again. Emily Cross. She folded the letter and asked the nurse to mail it. 2 days later, Emily died in her sleep. No tears, no one at the bedside. Only the open journal, its last line scribbled in haste. "I once thought I'd die in luxury. Now I only pray to die in truth." A week later, Leonard received the letter. He read it in silence, then placed it in the desk drawer beneath Helen's photograph. Mark, beside him, asked hoarsely, "Dad, is she gone?" "Yes," Leonard said, "but maybe she's been forgiven." Outside, the snow was melting. The young oak in front of Haven pushed out new buds. Leonard looked up and thought, justice, in the end, isn't for condemning. It's for teaching us how to begin again, even if it's too late. He set Emily's letter at the base of the tree with a small white flower. And the story closed there, where guilt was paid for with truth, justice was rinsed clean by mercy, and the lost, at last, found their way home. After the verdict, even with a sentence of community service, Mark Hayes lived like a man wearing invisible chains. Each morning he woke in the small room behind the Haven workshop. Portland sky veiled in mist beyond the window, the smell of fresh-cut wood flooding in, the smell that drew him back to the old house where his mother's laughter once lived. By day, he taught kids how to revive old computers, their fingers tapping clunky keyboards, their laughter bright and easy. None of them knew the quiet man at the table had once stood in a courtroom and bowed his head to say 2 words, "I'm guilty." At night, after the saws went silent and only the neon buzzed, Mark sat alone in the corner of the shop. He no longer counted down the days of his sentence. He counted how many times the nightmare returned. In sleep he saw Helen, his mother, standing in a doorway, hair lifted by a breeze, her smile as gentle as the old days. She didn't speak, she simply held out her hand. He ran to her, but each time he reached her, she turned to smoke. Then Leonard's voice came from behind, low and sad. "You made your mother cry, Mark." He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding hard enough to break. In those first weeks, Leonard kept his distance. Father and son traded short, practical lines. "Dad, I finished today's paperwork." "Good. Don't forget to check the new group." But Leonard's eyes were softer now. Once he set a hand on Mark's shoulder and said quietly, "You don't owe me a payback. Just live right." Simple words. But to Mark, they were a second sentence, one handed down by his own conscience. He knew how much his father had lost because of him. And even if Leonard had forgiven him, the memory wouldn't vanish. The cold phone call from another life. "Dad, that house is just an asset." Now, whenever he remembered, he felt small, foolish, and more ashamed than he'd thought possible. He started keeping a journal, much as Emily once had, though he didn't know it. On the first page he wrote, "I deceived my father, betrayed my dead mother, and lost myself. Justice saved me from prison, but not from the emptiness at night." Each evening he logged his feelings, guilt, fear, but also the minor efforts that might count as repair. A 10-year-old named Joshua, an orphan, often sat beside him while he worked. "Why are you sad, Mr. Mark?" the boy asked. Mark laughed softly and ruffled his hair. "Because I forgot the most important thing." "What's that?" "Gratitude." That summer, the Haven held a small anniversary gathering. Grace spoke. Leonard smiled from his seat. Mark stood at the edge of the yard, watching quietly. When a reporter asked, "Do you feel fully forgiven?" Mark said, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's when people see your mistake and still give you a chance to live." The quote ran the next morning and was shared widely. He didn't read it. He tucked the paper in a drawer as a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't need noise. It only needs a place in the heart. One night, Leonard came by late with an old family photo. Helen, a 10-year-old Mark, and Leonard, all beaming over the dinner table. He set it in front of his son. Helen used to say, "When you get lost, go back to where you started." Mark stared at the picture, throat tight. "Dad, I went too far." "No," Leonard said. "You just forgot the way." "What about Emily?" Mark asked, eyes down. Leonard sighed. "She found her peace in her own way. You still have time to find yours while you're alive." Mark nodded. Tears fell onto the old photo. That night, for the first time in months, he slept through. No dreams, no fear, only quiet. Autumn laid a deep red across Portland. Mark began a quiet journey, one not to run away, but to pay back what he'd taken. He carried a small notebook. Inside, a list of people he and Emily had harmed, a few employees scapegoated and fired, a small partner coerced into canceling a contract, and an elderly woman who lost her home because of a loan he'd pushed through when he was still playing finance. Every name, every address, every scar. First was Thomas Reed, a young engineer Mark had blamed for a failed project. Thomas opened the door and froze at the sight. Mark thinner, in a faded shirt, stripped of the old polished swagger. "I'm not here to explain," Mark said slowly. "I'm here to apologize. You lost your job because of me. I was wrong." Thomas stood silent for a moment, then pressed his lips together. "I hated you for 4 years, Mark. But looking at you now, hate doesn't mean much anymore." Mark nodded and handed him an envelope, a written offer to join the Haven as a project lead. Thomas looked down, then up again, his eyes easing. "Maybe. That's the best apology I've ever seen." Next was Mrs. Henderson, 74, who'd lost her home when Mark pushed a mortgage file to save the company. The house was gone, just foundation and weeds, and she lived in a care home. She didn't recognize him at first. He sat, took her hand, and said, "I'm the one who made you lose your house." She lifted cloudy eyes and studied him. "Son, if I kept your face in my memory, my heart would never rest. Let it go. I forgive you." He broke, sobbing. She patted his head like a grandson who had finally found his way home. "Thank you," he said. "But I'm going to build that house back. If not for you, then for others." A month later, Mark broke ground on Henderson House, a shelter for seniors with nowhere to go. He carved the wooden sign himself, a house of forgiveness. Street by street, memory by memory, he continued. Each apology, each handshake loosened the weight that had been crushing his chest. He realized the court had kept him out of prison, but only repentance could keep him out of himself. One afternoon, Leonard called him to the river. They sat on a bench, water sliding by in quiet sheets. "I heard you're visiting people from the past?" Leonard asked. "Yes. I want them to know I'm not the man I was." "Do you feel lighter?" Mark smiled faintly, eyes on the far bank. "Not exactly, but at least I feel honest." Leonard thought for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't letting it slide, Mark. It's looking your mistake in the eye, then choosing to believe people can change. I'm afraid I don't deserve it. You don't need anyone's permission to forgive yourself." A breeze came, tugging a few yellow leaves into the water. Leonard's eyes softened. "You know, Helen used to say, 'The day Mark learns to love with the truth is the day I'll smile in heaven.'" Silence. A single tear traced down Mark's cheek. "Dad, I think she's smiling now." By late fall, the Haven celebrated its first anniversary. On stage, Mark spoke, steady, low. "I lost my way. Without those mistakes, I would never have learned mercy. I'm not the man of million-dollar contracts anymore. I'm just someone learning how to be human again. Applause filled the room. Leonard stood in the front row, eyes bright with pride. Outside, the sunset washed the windows in gold. The young oak by the workshop swayed, leaves nodding as if in agreement. Mark looked up at the sky and spoke silently. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. And thank you, life, for a second chance. Somewhere in the wind, it felt like Helen whispering, soft as breath, "Be at peace, my son." And in that moment, Mark's regret stopped being a wound. It became a seed, rooting into mercy, into gratitude, into a peace that finally felt real. 18 months after the trial, Portland turned its seasons once more. On the roofline of the Haven the oak Mark and I planted had doubled in height. Every morning with the first light I sat beneath it and watched people arrive, apprentices with calloused hands, children laughing, and thought about the road we walked to get here. Who would have believed that a man who once crumpled in a courtroom, shaking under the weight of his son's betrayal, could sit here now, quiet as if none of it had ever happened? I'm no saint. There was a time I wanted Mark to suffer it all. Prison, shame, isolation. I believed the court's version of justice was the only balance this world could afford. But when I saw my son kneel, and later read Emily's final letter, I learned something simple and bitter. Justice isn't winning. Justice is understanding. Helen used to say, "A real father isn't perfect. He's brave enough to forgive." I failed at that for a long time. I let pride smother tenderness. I let hurt harden into a wall between two generations. And I, no one else, helped nudge Mark toward his worst choices. Now, when I watch my son teaching kids to fix old computers, I know this. Failure isn't forever. Only unwillingness to change is. Mark changed, and I learned how to love again. That afternoon, a group of film students came to interview me for a documentary about the Haven. A young woman asked, "Mr. Leonard, if you could go back, would you erase the pain?" I smiled and answered slowly, "No. Without it, I would never have learned that forgiveness is a form of justice." They fell silent. Maybe they didn't understand yet. One day, when they've lost something, they will. I stepped outside and stood before the oak. On the small wooden plaque, "Forgiveness is the highest form of justice," had faded under rain and time. I took out a knife and traced the letters again, slow, sure. When I finished, my hands were trembling. I whispered, "Helen, I did it. Late, but I kept my word." Above me, sunlight slipped through the leaves and warmed my face, like a touch. I knew it was her answer. A year into Portland's new spring, the Haven Workshop was no longer a small outpost on the edge of town. With the community's help, we opened 2 more branches in Salem and Eugene. Oregon began to feel stitched together by second chances. Mark stayed on the front lines. Not as an executive, not as a CFO, but as a teacher in a worn shirt, showing young people with records how to hold a tool steady and how to rebuild a life. I became the storyteller. I went to universities and churches and told a generation what it is in danger of losing: mercy and understanding. When I finished, auditoriums tended to fall quiet, not out of pity, but recognition. It's easy to see yourself in a story where love gives way to ego. One early summer day, a letter arrived from Claire Johnson, a social worker in Seattle. I cared for a patient named Emily Cross near the end. She asked me to deliver something. She called it her last debt. The next week, Claire came to the Haven with a small wooden box, worn but carefully kept. Mark met her at the gate. When she said the sender's name, he froze. I rested a hand on his shoulder. "Open it, son." Inside lay a silver necklace with a small pendant engraved. "Truth heals." Folded beneath it, a note in a shaky, familiar hand. "I don't have much time. If you're reading this, know that I finally understand. Only truth brings peace. I'm not asking forgiveness. I hope this small gift helps someone else get the chance I needed. Emily." Mark lowered his head, eyes wet. I held the necklace for a long, quiet moment and said, "Maybe she found the piece of peace we spent years trying to earn." Mark nodded. "Dad, I want to use the next round of fundraising to launch the Emily Project, for women who've fallen and want to start over." I looked at my son, steadfast, changed. "Do it. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's turning pain into good." 3 months later, the Emily Project launched. At the ceremony, Claire read Emily's letter aloud. The room went still, like a prayer. When she finished, Mark placed the silver necklace around the neck of a young woman starting life after a financial fraud sentence. "This is a symbol of truth," he said, "and a reminder that everyone deserves another chance." Applause rose. I watched from the back. For a heartbeat I saw Helen, her gentle smile folded into the afternoon light. The haven was no longer a place for just a father and a son. It had become a refuge for anyone who'd stumbled, where wrongs were not erased by decrees, but transformed by mercy. That night, after the Emily Project's ribbon cutting, I stayed alone in the workshop. Warm light pooled across the wood floor, reflecting a photo on the wall, Mark and me smiling, the oak towering behind us. I sat in an old chair and opened Helen's notebook. Between yellowed pages was a line in her soft hand. "Don't fear the fact that people fail. Fear the day they stop believing in the good." I read it again and let out a long breath. We all lose sight of the good, out of anger, fear, the hunger to be seen. What makes us different isn't that we fell, it's how we rise once we've hit the ground. I used to be a father who equated justice with punishment. Now I know. True justice begins when you face the pain and choose forgiveness over resentment. Only then do wounds stop bleeding. Mark once asked me, "Dad, how could you forgive me after everything?" I told him, "Because I couldn't bear to lose you twice. If I'd let hatred win, I'd be a walking shell, a soul trapped in yesterday. Forgiveness let me live on. It let my son be reborn." It turned our story into a small light for people still wandering. I looked out at Portland's gentle night, streetlights lifting the sky to a soft silver. I wanted to say this, not to Mark or Emily, but to anyone hearing our story. If you've been betrayed, if your trust has been torn, don't let that hurt define you. Let mercy do it. Forgiveness isn't condoning what was done. It's opening a door so you can be at peace. And if you're the one who's lost, don't be afraid to come back. Even when the world turns away, there's always someone willing to open their arms. If you can tell the truth and begin again. Helen once said, "Family isn't just blood, it's respect and love." Now I understand. Blood binds the body, only love keeps the soul. I closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and stepped onto the porch. Mark stood there with a hot cup of coffee. We didn't speak. We simply stared at the oak bending in the night wind. "See?" I whispered. "Helen's still here, in every good thing we do." Mark nodded. The breeze carried away the last thin whispers of the past. I smiled, then turned to you, the ones listening quietly to our story. If you've ever lost faith in family, remember, justice isn't only in court. It's in how you choose to live kindly when the dust settles. Only love and respect can make us belong to one another for real. And if you believe that too, stay with me, because the next story will make you cry and make you believe in people all over again.